Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Christy Bell. I'm the training coordinator for the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. I'd like to welcome you all to the latest installment of our monthly webinar series. This is Understanding THIRA with Matt Wall. Before we get started, you'll notice we're presenting in a little bit different format than we've used in the past. Matt has chosen to use the Share My Desktop view. So the desktop that you're looking at is actually Matt's desktop. In order to see the list of participants in the chat box on your screen, you'll need to click on the drop-down menu in the middle of your screen at the top. Click on the participant and chat buttons, and then you can drag those anywhere on your screen that's convenient for you. Due to the number of callers, we'll be muting participant lines during the session. If you have questions during the presentation, please do ask them. We ask that you do so via the chat feature. Simply type them in and they'll be answered in the same format. If you'd rather ask your questions or make your comments verbally, we ask that you hold those until Matt takes a break for questions or until the end. I will ask you to raise your hand using the raise hand button located directly below the list of participants. I will then recognize you individually and ask that individual only to unmute their line using #6, and I'll remind you about that when we get to a spot for questions. At the end, there'll be an opportunity to provide feedback, to include suggestions for topics, and we would very much appreciate yours. The session will be recorded, and a link will be provided to all registered participants to view the recorded session. Now to introduce our presenter for today. Matt Wall retired after 26 years from the Richmond Fire Department as a captain in 2006. He joined the VEDM mitigation team in 2007. Currently, Matt is the Hazard Mitigation Program Manager for Virginia. He has his master's degree in Urban and Regional Planning in 2008 from VCU and has been involved in the Virginia THIRA process since its inception in 2012. He's also married with 4 kids, 3 boys and a girl, and 1 grandson. Take it away, Matt.
Hi. First, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I do appreciate this. And I'll go through this. And as Christy said, I would appreciate, due to the format of this, if we could kind of hold the questions towards the end. I intend to address or give this a discussion about the THIRA with respect to how it works, where it came from, how it works, how the federal government is using it, how the Commonwealth is using it, and any potential updates that we're looking at. So without further ado, the THIRA background came about as a result of PPD 8, Presidential Policy Directive Number 8, signed on March 30th, 2011, which stated that the development of the National Preparedness Goal identifies core capabilities, a national preparedness system, a system to allow things to be able to track the progress, and to be able to build and improve capabilities necessary to prevent, protect, mitigate, respond to, and recover from those threats that pose the greatest risk to the security of our nation. Key here is that we look at not only the words that I've highlighted in that kind of burnt red, but also the idea of protect, mitigate, respond, recover, and to prevent. The THIRA background, as we continue, says that what it is that the ends that we wish to achieve is essentially the National Preparedness Goal. And the way in which we intend to achieve it is through the preparedness system, which is where the THIRA feeds in. The delivery is how we're going to do it using the National Planning System, with the reporting progress being the annual National Preparedness Report, which is a summation of all of the state preparedness reports, as well as those of federally recognized Indian tribes that are participating, as well as territories. The whole thing is designed to have a sustained engagement, to utilize the whole community concept, where everybody works together to build, to sustain, and where possible to be able to improve. Per the Comprehensive Preparedness Guide 201, there's a 4-step process in the THIRA activities, or in the development of the THIRA. And the first step is to identify threats and hazards of concern. The second step is to give those identified threats and hazards context. What is it that makes them important to your jurisdiction? The third step is to establish capability targets. What is it that you actually wish to be able to achieve in those mission-critical areas that were discussed? The response, recover, mitigate, protect, prevent. And then how are you going to apply those results? Look at it with what types of resource requirements that you have on hand, as well as resource requirements that you're actually going to need in order to be able to address the events. For the purposes of the THIRA, there are three basic types of threats and hazards. There's the natural, technological, which are specified as non-human caused failure of a system, and then human caused, which are defined as intentional action. Intentional action can either be terrorism or criminal. So examples. From the natural, obviously a hurricane, a pan flu epidemic, or drought. From a technological perspective, think of it as a dam failure or a hazardous materials event. And the separate between the human cause and the technological with the hazardous materials event is the fact that the hazardous materials event can be as a result of an accident rather than as a result of something that was deliberate or human caused, deliberately human caused. So picture, for instance, a tanker truck that goes off the road or a train derailment, which we've had too many of lately. Human caused can be anything from an improvised explosive device, regardless of the delivery mechanism, a threatened or an actual biological event. Good example of this would be the recent scares over the several years with the white powder scares that are in at the post offices, and in some cases where the actual bacterial element was involved in those events and caused issues. Or cyber events. Cyber events is obviously something that we're all very concerned with because of the interconnectivity as well as the issues that are associated with what happens if stuff happens. So let's contextualize it. This is the actual earthquake scenario that we used a couple of years ago. And it was based on the fact that we had an earthquake in August of 2011. And then we started thinking, well, what happens if we have a similar earthquake in that geographical region of the Commonwealth that's maybe just a hair larger, which is entirely possible considering the fault lines that are located there. And what happens if it was, say, a little bit closer to Richmond? So obviously what we did was we contextualized it for 11 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday in late January, so after the holidays, a 6.5 magnitude event. The Mineral, Virginia earthquake was a 5.9, so the 6.5 is entirely possible. Probable? No. Possible? Yes. So what happens now is that, of course, this earthquake is a significant magnitude, larger than the previous one, and it's going to cause damages in a 50-mile radius, significant structural, and discussion of the older buildings, how they're going to collapse due to the age of the mortar and the construction methodology. School buildings with truss roofs have caved in. And this is a classic example of, if you remember the Louisa schools were actually damaged to the point that they had to be rebuilt. But in this case, if it were to happen at this time of the day, at this time of a middle of the week, you're looking also at the possibility of schools actually being in session. So you're going to have casualties. You're going to have issues that are associated with living facilities in at least one hospital. You're also going to have loss of sheltering requirements because, sometimes schools are used as shelters, so you're going to have immediate sheltering needs. You're going to have loss of water systems because of the ruptures within the main lines, as well as the loss of private water systems because of the shaking and the liquefaction that goes on to the ground. So what is it that you're going to do? And this is an example of how they contextualize the hazard for what may happen as a result of an event. And so you go through and you say, what are the scenarios and what are the issues we need? So what is it that we're going to need? And that gets into the core capabilities. Essentially there, as I said earlier from the PPD-8, it defined 5 mission areas: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And under each of those core capability areas, you've got, on those mission critical areas, you've got multiple core capabilities. And this, in case I didn't mention it, all images from this PowerPoint presentation are pulled from CPG 201. and as are some of the quotes that you'll see, and I'll make certain that you're provided with a link to the actual document at the end of this presentation. So typically most of our aspects and most of our things that we do in emergency services have all been response oriented. So under the earthquake scenario, we're going to have to look at things like infrastructure systems, mass care services, mass search and rescue. But then after the response is over, we've got the recovery, where we're looking at the economic recovery. What is it that we're going to do with the infrastructure to bring it back online so that businesses are going to be up and running? What is it that we're looking at for housing or for health and social services? The water lines have been, damaged. What all is going to be needed for natural and cultural resources to be able to try to recover or rebuild or document what's happened to historical structures? So under the identify, what it is you're doing is that you're looking at the threats and hazards of concern based on a combination of expertise, forecasting, subject matter expertise, and other available resources such as documentation or studies, or in Virginia's case, as is the case of most states, for the natural events, we significantly used the State Hazard Mitigation Plan because that provides a historical record of presidentially declared disasters as well as major events that have occurred. The identifying the list of threats and hazards a primary concern. We discussed the contextualization with the presentation of the earthquake example, where we took the earthquake, which we know had historically occurred in August of 2011, and then contextualized it as if it were just a little bit higher, because we know that that's going to already exceed the state capacity for response and state capacity for any other category or mission critical area. Under each capacity, you work to identify and assess each threat to create a specific capability target. So if we go back to the individual capabilities here, what is it that we want to be able to do for mass care services or mass search and rescue or risk and disaster resilience assessment, economic recovery? What are appropriate measures for success? And again, these have to be specific, and usually your measures for success fall under the category of numbers, which will include things such as time, amount of effort, percentage of recovery, percentage of activity. So as an example, a core capability target of success for a planning core capability, obviously it has to be successful, because otherwise it's not simply a success. Successful implementation as appropriate for the event for all plans and annexes. You need to be able to monitor to show that you're able to demonstrate this and document the results. And where required, provide a review of after-action reports. Since there's no specific number associated with this, the presumption is that it's 100% of the time. If there's a failure of the plans and the processes that are in place, then that would obviously be documented so that changes could be made to be specific to that type of an event or the resource requirement or the action that was being taken. Clearly, implementation time frame will be driven by the event. In the case of the earthquake, it's like, goodness gracious, all of a sudden it happened, now we're putting it into implementation right now. Whereas in the case of a hurricane, you're saying we have 3 days pre-landfall. So on day 4, we're going to start looking at what it is that we're going to start sketching out where it is it might hit. So day 3, we then start activating a little bit more and putting specific plans and processes in place. Day 2, we might be pre-locating resources and in accordance to the plan. Another example would be the critical transportation core capability. Within 72 hours post-event impact, reestablish transportation corridors for, at minimum, the transportation of required resources to save lives and provide assistance to survivors. It's definitive, it's measured, it's there, and it's a target goal for us to look at. With respect to the core capability measures, they were developed for the Commonwealth in Virginia in coordination with the VERT agencies and after consultation and after several different meetings, and have been approved or were approved in 2012 through the Office of the Secretary of Public Safety and Office of Veterans Affairs, which was prior to the Office of Public Safety and Homeland Security, which now exists. Another core capability target: infrastructure systems within 72 hours. Get them back working. Critical, obviously, for the needs of the population, but as well as for the response and the recovery components, too. Not only that, but this is a very strong economic indicator. We need to get the businesses that keep people up and busy and working up again as soon as possible, too. To a homeowner in a impacted area, even if their home is intact, if they can't make the mortgage payment because the homeowner is no longer have a business or is no longer employed by the business, or the business is on a hiatus, they have the potential to lose that business. So as a consequence, you need to get everything up and running for the economic base to be able to survive, as well as the sustainability of the community. And ultimately, for the results, each core capability, you have to be able to estimate the resources required to achieve the capability targets selected through the use of community assets and mutual aid, while also considering preparedness activities, including mitigation. So this is obviously where the community, in this case the state, has to be able to put in a priority as to how they're going to expend their resources. What is it that they're going to choose to be able to spend their money on? Is it more important for them to have, in a jurisdictional basis, is it more important for them to be able to purchase another fire truck? Or is it more important for them to go out and do a resiliency measure upon their locality-owned water system? Obviously, this is something that's going to be a local decision. There can be some inputs, obviously, from political higher-ups and from other funding streams, but this is something that needs to be done and is part of the analysis process of the THIRA. For the THIRA and the State Preparedness Report, that's what the SPR stands for, we look at it from the perspective of a state capability target is evaluated from the state and should not consider federal assistance. And there's a typo there. We can consider mutual aid from other states, but we cannot consider federal mutual aid with respect, or federal assistance. So that, and it should read that it could include assistance from other states. I'll make sure that typo is corrected. It's understood that 100% capacity for every capability cannot happen, but how close to that 100% do you want to get? So, for example, if you have an absolutely disastrous hurricane that comes in, impacts the Hampton Roads region of Virginia and sweeps up the coast, you have the potential for several 100,000 people to be unhomed due to storm surge and the damaging of the structures. Kind of like as if we had something like Sandy that occurred to Virginia. What is the capacity that we wish to have as a state with respect to long-term housing or long-term shelter? Do we want to say 15,000 people? We want to say 90,000 people? And even if we say 100,000 people, that's not going to cover the several 100,000 people that might be unhomed. However, knowing what the state capability is provides us with the measure in this type of an event to be able to say where it is that we wish to be at. So our state capability target is where it is we wish to be at, and the capability, let's say for that 100,000 that we want to be at, and these are just random numbers, don't take this for any type of granted or any type of inside political perspective, because it's not. If the state capability target is to be able to house 100,000 people in a long-term shelter, and our current state capability is 30,000 people, then obviously the gap that the state wishes to address through mutual aid, through building shelters, through identifying resources or whatever mechanism it can find, would be 70,000 people. So in essence, what you're doing is that you're using the threat hazard identification and risk assessment document and process to be able to look at your core capabilities in those mission areas, the desired level of what it is you wish to be at, the current capacity that you have to be able to say, all right, what we want now is we have a gap here. And then that's part of the gap analysis that's within the process of this. This slide I stole from Brett Burdick, who used it at a coordinator's briefing. And frankly, what it shows is it says the maximum possible hazard, given the actual conditions, that a hazard can generate. So, an example, if we go back to the hurricane might be a Category 5 that impacts Virginia. And that's the maximum possible hazard. And the reason it's the maximum is because it doesn't get classified any higher than that. However, it's never happened to, and it's not likely to happen, but it is possible. So we say, what is the maximum probable impact? Well, the maximum probable impact, we're going to say, is probably a Category 3. So we're going to use the Category 3 as the maximum probable impact because we've experienced this in the past, and because it's got a return period of less than 1,000 years, or it has a higher probability of more than 1 in 1,000. And so, anytime that you're using, by the way, anytime you're using a predictive modeling, it should be based on best available data and not just scientific crazy guess. So you're using the THIRA when you're generating your scenarios, but you're also using the historical information that's available to be able to generate the scenarios with the measures of accuracy. This means that when we go through the scenarios as a locality basis, but also on the state basis, there should take into some consideration the historical impacts, any studies that have been made, previous occurrences that would tend to indicate that this type of an event is going to occur more often, or recent occurrences that may have changed the risk for a community. So, for instance, if you have a community that is very close to the coast, and the last time that they had a Category 2 hurricane hit that community, they had a population of 1,000 people. But now they've got a population of 30,000 people and have increased the amount of impervious surface, then we understand that the same exact event is going to have a more significant impact upon that community, not just because of the population increase, but also because of the construction that's going on. So the idea is to generate a scenario that has a maximum probable impact, so it's mostly realistic, but it's not an oh my goodness, this is the end of the world, the earthquake, the earthquake is being triggered by the asteroid that has come down and struck in the middle of Virginia. I need to also point out that the determination of a state capability target is a policy issue, and that's as it would be within a locality. It is a determination made by using the targeted and contextualized hazards based upon the decision by the policymakers as to where they wish to have their resources focused on in order to overcome any gaps within the systems that they have in place in any of the mission critical areas. The THIRA and the state preparedness system have a direct relationship to the national preparedness system. Again, we discussed the whole community perspective and the core capabilities, and then they're all implemented using the National Incident Management System. Step one was identifying and assessing the risk, or identifying and then contextualizing it as assessing the risk. estimating the capability requirements to be able to address the issues that you've talked about that I've talked about within the core capabilities that are there. How is it that you're going to build and sustain those capabilities? What resources are going to be delivered? What agendas are going to be done? What type of public outreach is there? What type of memorandums of understanding or mutual aid agreements are going to be needed to put in place to be able to achieve the desired goals of the community or of the state? And then once you have those capabilities built and sustainable, how are you going to deliver them? Well, you might sit there and say, we're going to have the capability of being able to shelter 15,000 people, but if the people aren't able to get to the shelter, then the capacity and the capability to deliver that sheltering for 15,000 people doesn't mean a thing. So the objective is, how is it that you're going to be able to deliver the capabilities to the population that's at need during the event, before, during, and after the event? And then once you've done that, how are you going to exercise or validate those capabilities? Are you going to run exercises to be able to say, yes, we've been demonstrated that we've been able to put 15,000 people into this shelter? Or are you going to look at it and say, well, we're just simply going to wait till an event occurs, and then you don't have any real true measure as to whether you've got the capacity or the capability to actually achieve the goal that you've set forth? And then, of course, you've got the continual reviewing and updating of what's going on through your after-action reports, through after your exercise reports from your other stuff. And you continue to identify and do the risk assessment. These next slides are drawn from information that came as a result of multiple discussions with FEMA Region 3 and FEMA headquarters, and presentations that they provided. I boiled down a lot of their information and put it into a couple of slides to be able to say, this is what we have. Under the national preparedness, the regions are using all of the state THIRAs to inform a regional THIRA document. And then the regional THIRA documents are going to FEMA headquarters in D.C., where they sit down and they say, okay, what we have here is that we've got bits and pieces. We have the potential to be able to say, these are the threats that these areas are looking at. They're shared. So, for instance, Maryland, D.C., and Virginia all share a concern of what would happen if a hurricane comes in. Or they all share a concern of what would be a significant winter event. So that allows FEMA headquarters and FEMA Region 3 to be able to say, let's start gearing our planning and our training and start identifying resources to be able to meet or to be able to assist in meeting some of the gaps that have been identified. And they do this by sharing the THIRA and the state preparedness information with their internal FEMA staff and other federal partners to help guide their outreach and projects. So they could actually share it with other federal partners such as HUD, or with the U.S. Army Corps, or with the Small Business Administration, or with any other entity that could potentially be involved within an event that would occur. An ongoing process by FEMA headquarters and by FEMA Region 3 is to review the THIRA and SPR processes to determine if or what changes should be made for the next iteration. And I need to point out that the last iteration went in on December 31st of this year. An after-action survey has already been completed, or an after-action report has already been completed, and they're in the process of analyzing this right now to see what recommendations they're going to be able to make for the next iteration of the THIRA, which will be due to FEMA no later than December 31st of 2015. Under the response criteria, they want to utilize the information to inform the ESF outreach, emergency support function outreach, and guide discussions with state partners. And that the THIRA and the state preparedness report are currently informing federal plan development and which plans will be prioritized or written in the future. obviously, if the state says we find an issue here, and FEMA has not identified that as an issue, and it's a consistent messaging from the state, then FEMA needs to understand that they've got to get busy and start generating appropriate interactions. And part of that appropriate interaction is the participation in the review of the THIRAs and the state preparedness reports to be able to identify or look at those needs and say, all right, this has been determined to be important. What is it that we can do to help fulfill some of these gaps that are in the range here? Under the recovery component, they want to utilize existing information from the THIRA and the state preparedness report to inform the all hazards recovery plan. And frankly, that means where you start getting into the recovery support functions under the National Recovery Framework, which is currently out also. So you want to identify the capability targets, the threat hazard identification, and again, participate in the review of the THIRAs and the state preparedness reports. Mitigation, they want to compare the HIRA and the THIRA to what they have to say. And the THIRA comes into play here because now we're looking at the identification of the HIRA as the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, and the THIRA is here. But in the hazard identification and risk analysis, it's critical because that's where a lot of the historical information for the hazards component of the THIRA comes in. They want to make sure that what we're doing is that we're using a valid descriptives, and they want to make sure that we're using valid resources to be able to support the threats and the hazards that we've identified within the THIRA. Then based on that, they want to look at the state preparedness report results to be able to drive some outreach. At what capacity or what percentage of capacity, in what areas are you missing or do you have resource needs that the state or that the jurisdiction does not wish, or the UASI does not wish to be able to fulfill? So where is it that the federal government can step up to be able to be of a successful partner? And again, they wish to participate in the review of the THIRAs and the state preparedness reports. This goes on after the submission, prior to the submission of the regional THIRA to FEMA headquarters. It's key, and I've said this before in previous presentations, but this is now coming to more and more fruition. It came about originally that the jurisdiction had to have an accepted and approved THIRA in order to be eligible for DHS grants overall. Well, now they're looking at the THIRA and the state preparedness report versus the federal investment justifications versus the local request for the investment justifications for EMPG, to be able to say these are the reasons why we want this to be able to fulfill this gap. And then FEMA headquarters is starting a pilot project to be able to look at the Homeland Security Program grant project and the state preparedness report to be able to say, all right, you've said that you wanted to be able to fulfill this gap, so have you closed that gap over the last year? Did you use the money to actually address the priority that you identified within your THIRA, or the gap that you identified within your THIRA and within your state preparedness report? I will point out that FEMA did say, and I quote, everything is just guidance at this point, which means they're still in the process of being able to identify what measures they're going to be using for the pilot project to look at the federal funding justification for the Homeland Security grants that are being put out. That's a very critical point. Overall, for states and territories, the THIRA informs preparedness reports. It helps to develop the Homeland Security strategies, allows the states to collect information on targets, and I highlighted this in red because this will bleed into the state actions that are going on now. Current capabilities at the local level, and then provides jurisdictions a vehicle for tracking and reporting on those gaps and on those objectives. For FEMA, this informs program strategies, provides critical performance measurement data for FEMA programs. Headquarters is starting a pilot project to look at funding. Critical performance measured data. Those two are directly related and will be an important source of information for the 2015 National Preparedness Report. Commonwealth THIRA. In March of last year, there was a new, when they combined the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security into the same office, they rewrote the section in section 2.2 through 222.1, and this is paragraph D out of it, where it talks about how the Secretary shall annually develop the THIRA. The THIRA is designed to look at current capabilities at the local levels. Will identify a list of threats and hazards of primary concern to the Commonwealth, describe the threats and hazards of concern, in other words, contextualizing them, identify the specific capability target for each core capability, and then estimate the resources required to achieve the capability targets. But now, instead of looking at it from a state perspective, you're looking at it from a local and a regional perspective. Same criteria, just crunched down onto a more local and regional scale. Additionally, the THIRA report will assess the Commonwealth state of planning, organizing, training, equipment, exercising, evaluating, and the ability to take corrective action, as well as any shortfalls in these areas. It will be used, or will be, this Commonwealth strategic approach to improving future preparedness, and must be delivered to various committees no later than November 1st of each year. As I said, this was passed in March of this year. In October 31st of this year, the first THIRA was presented, and this is the link that it can be found at. It's obviously online. It is a public document. It is free to be viewed, used, dispersed as you find appropriate. Now, the connections between the federally mandated THIRA and the THIRA are the legislative, where the Presidential Directive 8 and the Code of Virginia parallel in language to a large degree. And they're looking at the programmatic component, and that should be DHS, not DHA. I apologize for the typo. Grant funding requirement, and it provides measures. So if the state is not eligible to be able to get money from the federal government, from the Department of Homeland Security, because of us not having a federally mandated THIRA, then the localities will not be eligible to get the money that those funding, the EMPG and the other funding from the state. From a functional perspective, the information that we will be getting from the localities and the jurisdictions, in addition to the state agencies and the state overall capacities, will eventually come together to feed a singular, comprehensive, much more inclusive THIRA that will then be provided up to FEMA and to the federal government, because it'll provide them with more accurate measures of needs and projected impacts, as well as capacities. In the THIRA, which you can identify or get at the linked point that I provided a couple slides earlier, the next steps that should be partially taken, at least during this year, will be to complete a review of data sets that are available. Without the information that's available, you cannot come up with accurate measures. And where data gaps are missing, this provides us an opportunity to be able to say, okay, we're missing this information. What can we do to try to develop it for the next iteration of the THIRA? Or what can we do to assist the community in creating this system? All of this involves conducting outreach to the different regions and localities, as well as the collection of the information once we identify what data sets are available, the collection, and then being able to actually take it and contextualize them and collate them against themselves. Once we've done that, we can validate then some of the measures that are used in the local and in the regional and in the state capability targets. We work with the appropriate entities on the prioritization process. What this means is we're not going to tell you, or the state's not going to say, or the person that writes the THIRA is not going to say, or the THIRA is going to say, all right, such and such a jurisdiction, you have to do this. What it is it's saying, all right, you have identified these as priorities. How is it, or what is it that you wish to be able to accomplish achieving in closing the gap on these capabilities that you've identified as your priorities? What mechanisms do you have in place? How can we help coordinate and resource and work with everybody? In other words, again, a whole community perspective where we're all working together. Once those steps are done, then we need to be able to present the information in the form of the next report to the various legislators and potentially do it through multiple presentations throughout the state also. And then also put in place a mechanism to ensure that the next version of the THIRA will continue to be more and more accurate, more viable, and in many ways more visible, so that there's a transparency of what's going on, as well as more people being able to understand the system. I've spoken for a long time now. I'm going to get a drink of water. Well, hopefully there are going to be some questions. Thank you.
Response annex, it says that it's supposed to be attached to the emergency operations plan. Is this going to be a separate document, or do I take the terrorism response annex and enhance it? How's that going to work?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of your question. Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. The terrorism response annex is what you had online that I downloaded last week in preparation for the call today. This document says it's attached to the emergency operations plan. Is it attached to the EOP, or is it a separate document?
The THIRA itself, the Threat Hazard Identification and Risk Assessment document, is not part of the Emergency Operation Plan. It is a document that can be referenced with information providing. It is a document that can be incorporated by reference, but it in of itself is not part of the Emergency Operation Plan as a standalone annex. Did that answer your question?
Yes, then where is the template for the THIRA? Because I didn't find it.
Well, there is a direct link to the state THIRA, and as far as tools and other mechanisms for the localities, I will be more than happy to be able to generate some stuff. With respect to the THIRA, last year's was the first iteration, and it was the development and the recognition that it had to be done, and it was also the generation of the originating report. And part of the development of the THIRA process for the state will be the creation of templates and other information. They do not currently exist yet, but they're in the process of being developed to be able to be distributed.
Okay. Thank you.
Matt, we had another question. I sent it to you.
I'm looking for it, but I can't find it. If you could read it to me, I'd appreciate it.
it says, why is the capability target geared for less than probable impact? If this level is expected, why would you not plan for that level?
You don't plan for that level because it's not probably fiscally or realistically capable to plan for that level. If you have an impact, let's say that we'll go back to the Category 3 hurricane that comes in again, and let's say that hurricane unhomes 100,000 people in one region of the state. It's not feasible to be able to assume that the state and the localities combined are going to be able to put up temporary shelters or be able by themselves for 100,000 people. The same as with Hurricane Katrina that hit the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi, they required the federal assistance for the long-term housing. We would require federal assistance for long-term housing also. The idea behind having that capability also means that it must be immediately available. So obviously we haven't built Virginia shelters for 100,000 people, much less been able to identify the resources to be able to do so. So we might sit there and say, well, we can create a temporary shelter, for 30,000 people for 3 to 30 days, but then for long-term sheltering, we would have to be playing a lot of it by ear with a lot of federal assistance. The idea is to be able to identify what potentials could occur and then what gaps you wish to be able to have on hand or wish to be able to address while recognizing that you can't address everything. Does that make sense?
I think it does. Does anyone else have any other questions? And if you could, before you leave today, please fill out the participant feedback survey. The link is posted in the chat window. Matt, thank you so much for presenting today. We really appreciate it. And everyone, thank you for attending.
You're very welcome. I'll go back and I'll correct the typos on the original slides, and I'll also add an additional slide that shows a link to the CPG 201 and the federal document, just to make it easy for anybody that participated to find stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. And everyone, this recording will be posted in about a week along with the presentation, so you can access it then. Thank you so much.